all the furnishings and the articles of the tabernacle, because what was he doing here? He was fulfilling his promise to them to make them a kingdom of priests. And so Yahovah started his portion. He made a vow that this is what he was going to do, so he got started on it right away. The Israelites were down there goofing off. They were actually breaking the covenant while he was doing his part of the covenant. Now, remember he said he was jealous? And when Moses saw that, Yahovah told Moses that's what they're doing down there. Moses went and saw it for himself. Hello everyone, this is Hillary, welcoming you to another episode of It's Not As You Perceive. I hope you're doing well and receiving the blessings of Yahovah and having a great day. Thank you for joining me today. We're continuing our study on the Gospel of the Kingdom of God, and this is Lesson 13. Today we're focusing on the reconciliation of a broken marriage. So let's get started. Reconciliation is the act of restoring compatibility, friendly relations, and broken relations between friends, spouses, even countries, in order to reestablish peace and trust between them once again. Reconciliation agreements bring persons together in agreement with each other. If the previous agreement was violated and resulted in separation, then the reconciliation agreement would bring them together again. So if separation was between husband and wife, then the reconciliation agreement would result in the renewal of cohabitation between them, because that reconciliation would destroy the effect of the legal papers or the deed that they have for separation. The gospel of reconciliation is a message of peace and restoration that Yahovah offered to his people Israel. This was important because Israel had agreed to having an exclusive relationship with Yahovah at Mount Sinai, and they sealed this through a blood covenant. But they fell out of favor with Yahovah because they broke the covenant. He wanted to restore the covenant relationship with them, the house of Judah and the house of Israel, which is the nation of Israel. In Ezekiel 16, verses 8 to 14, Yahovah describes his love that he had for Israel when he entered into covenant with them. He said, "Now when I passed by you and looked upon you, behold, your time was the time of love, and I spread my skirt over you and covered your nakedness. Yes, I swore unto you and entered into a covenant with you, says Yahovah Elohim, and you became mine. Then I washed you with water. Yes, I thoroughly washed away your blood from you, and I anointed you with oil. I clothed you also with the broidered work, and dressed you with badger's skin. And I girded you about with fine linen, and I covered you with silk. I decked you also with ornaments, and I put bracelets upon your hands, and a chain on your neck. And I put a jewel on your forehead, and earrings in your ears, and a beautiful crown upon your head. Thus were you decked with gold and silver, and your raiment was of fine linen and silk and broidered work. You did eat fine flour and honey and oil, and you were exceeding beautiful, and you did prosper into a kingdom, and your renown went forth among the heathen for your beauty. For it was perfect through my comeliness, which I had put upon you, says Yahovah Elohim. Yahovah chose Israel over all the other nations in the world. He fell in love with her when she was young, and he protected her and brought her to himself. That's what he said when he brought her out of Egypt and spoke to her. Now, Yahovah promised to make Israel into a holy nation and a kingdom of priests. But did he have a reason for doing this besides his love for her? He chose Israel out of all the nations of the world, even though all the nations belong to him, because that's what he said. He said he did not choose Israel because they were the largest nation or because they were better than the other nations, because they were not. He said they were the smallest of all nations. So why did he choose Israel? Did he have a special purpose in mind when he chose her? Some think that God was showing favoritism when he chose Israel for himself. But I think he did this so that the nations of the world would be jealous and desire for Yahovah to be their God, because he was a powerful God and their God was unable to do anything for them. But with Yahovah, Israel had the reputation of being wise and strong and winning wars and battles, while the other nations knew that Israel's God fought for them and he protected them. But Yahovah had a purpose for choosing Israel, because he does nothing without a purpose. He chose them for the purpose of being a light to the nations. Well, according to the teachings of the prophets, Amos, Hosea, and Isaiah, Israel was chosen by God not just as a privilege. Israel was chosen for carrying out a responsibility, because privilege comes with responsibility. So Israel's responsibility to Yahovah as a holy nation and a kingdom of priests was, first of all, to worship Yahovah. Second, to obey him fully. And thirdly, to keep his covenant. And then their purpose was to be a light to the nations of the world. In Isaiah 49 and verse 6, Yahovah said Israel was to be a light to the nations. He also said, "For my house shall be called a house of prayer for all nations." So then you see, it was supposed to be called a house of prayer, not just for Israel, but for all nations. Yahovah said to Israel, "It is too light a thing that you should be my servants to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved of Israel." In other words, it's not asking you much to take care of yourself, but I will give you as a light to the nations, that my salvation may reach to the end of the earth. So Yahovah wanted the other nations that he didn't choose to know about him, to know about his salvation. And he said his light. That's what he's calling his salvation. Information about what he has done, he is calling it his light. I will give you as a light to the nations. So he is giving Israel as the beam, the light that will show the way to the other nations of the earth how Yahovah saves. They are supposed to teach the nations of the world about the salvation that Yahovah brings. In Isaiah 42, verses 1 and verse 4, Yahovah was speaking of Yeshua in these verses, because Yahovah sees Yeshua as Israel. He is the Israel, the ultimate Israel. When he went down to Egypt to deliver the children of Israel, he told Moses to speak to Pharaoh and tell him to let his son go. And who was his son? He called his son Israel in that conversation that he gave Moses to have with Pharaoh. So he said in Isaiah 42 verses 1 and 4, he said, "Behold my servant whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. I have put my spirit upon him. He will bring forth justice to the nations. He will not fail or be discouraged till he has established justice in the earth. This is speaking about the Messiah. This is speaking about Yeshua. So Yahovah is seeing the nation of Israel now, but that's only a picture of what Yeshua, his real ultimate Israel, will do and be. He will be a light to the nations. And as a matter of fact, Israel failed in this purpose for which they were called. When Yeshua came, he fulfilled that purpose for which Israel was called. So Yahovah went and established his covenant with Israel after he brought them out. So it is important that we see how the covenant was established so that we can understand the truths surrounding the reconciliation of the covenant. So if we don't know there's a covenant, then there's nothing to reconcile. If we don't know that the covenant was broken, there's still nothing to reconcile. But if we know how the covenant was made, then we can understand the reconciliation agreement that Yahovah gives to Israel later on after they break the covenant. So in making this covenant with them, he first gave them an offer, and he told Moses to go out and speak to them and say to them, "You yourselves have seen what I did to Egypt, and how I carried you on eagle's wings and brought you to myself. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all the nations you will be my treasured possession, although the whole earth is mine. You will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." And he said to Moses, these are the words you should say to Israel. And this is found in Exodus 19, verses 4 to 6. So Israel accepted Yahovah's offer and replied, "We will do everything that Yahovah says." And in this offer, Yahovah then established a meeting of the minds with Israel, because Israel was there when he delivered them. They saw everything that he had done. So when he said to them, "You yourself have seen what I did to Egypt," then Israel can confirm and agree, yes, that is true, what you said. This is a meeting of the mind that Yahovah had with Israel. So this common ground was based on the fact that he actually supernaturally delivered them out of Egypt's bondage. They saw all the miracles that he did, and the plagues he sent on Egypt, where it was a judgment. All those plagues, they were a judgment against the gods of Egypt. And to let Pharaoh know that he, Yahovah, is the one and only God, the true and living God. See, when Moses went to Pharaoh first and told him that the God of the Hebrews had sent him, Pharaoh said, I don't know him. I don't know your God. Therefore, I will not let Israel go. Now, this was a bad thing that Pharaoh said, because now he is asking God to show him himself. And this is how he showed him, which was not good for Pharaoh. So not only did Yahovah deliver Israel from the bondage of Egypt through his great and miraculous deeds, but he also protected them from his judgment that he wrought on their enemy, Egypt. He also destroyed their enemy and brought Israel to himself. You know, he destroyed their enemy when they crossed the Red Sea, and he caused the water to come back on them and drowned all of them. So now he had said that before to Israel. He said, don't worry, when they were getting all panicked, I will destroy your enemy and you will never see them again. So when he destroyed their enemy, he brought them to himself. He brought them, like he said, on eagle's wings. That means with great power and a mighty hand. He brought them to himself, to a place where they could enjoy no longer slavery, but liberty. No longer fear, but they were in a safe place in his protection. They witnessed all his mighty works, his powers, his might, his strength, and his wisdom. Therefore, they confirmed the truth of his word by their unanimous acceptance of his offer, saying, we will do everything Yahovah has said. The next step in establishing his relationship with Israel was to personally introduce himself to them. Israel knew he was with them every step of the way as he delivered them from Egypt, because they witnessed the great and miraculous things he had done in the process of delivering them. But they had never met him. And what they have known about gods in Egypt were idols, things they made with their hands, and they could see their God. Even though their God did absolutely nothing, at least they knew the name of their God and they could see what their God looked like. But with Yahovah, they could see all his powers, they could see everything, but they couldn't see him. So now they didn't know that he had a voice. Their gods don't have a voice either. But they didn't know that Yahovah had a voice. So he brought them to himself and he spoke to them from Mount Sinai. And they heard his voice, showing Israel that he was a living God. He gave them his covenant verbally. They all heard it, which they had vowed to keep. And he did not give them the whole covenant because they got scared. They got scared and they said, oh, we can't listen to this anymore. We think we're going to die. We're afraid, Moses. Please let it stop. And in other words, they said, you go talk to him. And whatever he says to you, we will obey. This is in Exodus, where Yahovah gave them the 10 commandments. He had to stop there because they couldn't stand the power and the awesomeness of him. They thought they were going to die, because that's why they were so afraid. So Moses told them that Yahovah had only come to speak to them in order to prove them and let his fear be upon them so that they would not sin against him. But still they asked Moses to be their representative to Yahovah, and whatever Yahovah said, they will do. Well, this was the second time they had vowed to obey Yahovah. Whatever he says, we will do. They said it first when he gave them the offer, and right now, in the middle of them receiving the covenant, they stopped the covenant, and they said it again the second time. They vowed to obey him. Okay? Well, Yahovah approved their request, and then he called Moses to come up the mountain to receive the covenant that he was making with Israel. So here he dictated his covenant to Moses. Moses was the representative of the people, and Moses wrote down everything Yahovah said. He wrote it in a book with his own handwriting. Yahovah didn't write it for him. Moses wrote it in a book with Moses' own handwriting. By the time Moses was done writing the covenant, he had the 10 commandments, he had the judgments of the covenant, the law of the covenant. So Yahovah gave him the full covenant and even told him how to seal the covenant. He was supposed to seal the covenant with blood. He told him what to do and how to do that. So in Exodus 24, it tells us that Moses wrote down everything that Yahovah had said. Now Moses comes down the mountain with the book of the covenant, and the children of Israel are fine. They're not doing anything bad. They're in good standing. And he read it to the people because Yahovah told him to do that. Okay? But it was also important for Moses to read it because the people said, you go get the message and then come back and give it to us. So now that he got the message, he had to come back and give it to the people. As a result, he had to read the whole book of the covenant to the people. And we see the parts of the book of the covenant like we spoke about earlier. When Moses was done reading, they all responded, we will do everything Yahovah has said. We will obey. So now they agreed. This is the third time they have now agreed to do whatever Yahovah says. So Moses took the blood that Yahovah told him he should kill the animals and use the blood of the animal, half of it Moses took, and he sprinkled the blood on the book of the covenant, and then he sprinkled the people with the rest of the blood. Now, this blood sprinkling means that they've heard the covenant, they agree to the covenant, so now they're sealing the covenant. The blood seals the covenant. Now, the people are in a blood covenant with Yahovah. So this covenant is Yahovah's covenant. He dictated the whole thing to Moses. So Jehovah's covenant described the Ten Commandments. It described the judgments, also the law. So we see that the book of the law contained his instructions on how to govern themselves according to his judgments, his commandments, and the laws or statutes. Another word for laws is statutes, which they had vowed to keep. But by their promise to perform and the sealing of the covenant, Israel confirmed their covenant or affirmed their covenant with Yahovah. Now, this covenant is a bilateral covenant, meaning they have a part to play and Yahovah had a part to play. So they exchanged a promise for a promise. Yahovah had a promise and they made a promise. So if they do their part, Yahovah does his part. They vowed to worship him exclusively. He was going to be their God, and they agreed to that. They wouldn't have any other gods before him. Through this establishment of the covenant, Yahovah and Israel were now married, and it was a spiritual marriage. He became their God, and they became his people. Now, in a bilateral covenant, we know that's a conditional covenant. Okay? The covenant he had with Abraham was unconditional. Abraham had nothing to do. Yahovah had everything to do. But in this covenant with the children of Israel, they would obey him fully and keep his covenant. In return, Yahovah was going to make them a holy nation and a kingdom of priests, and he would be their God. But because they didn't, they lost. The meeting of the minds between both parties is essential for a covenant, especially a bilateral covenant. Then he made the offer, which is another element of the covenant which must be there in a bilateral covenant, or even any covenant, to be honest with you, not just a bilateral covenant. So the elements of a covenant, or even an agreement, a contract, it must have a meeting of the minds. There must be an offer with consideration of value. That's why when you make a contract, you have to, offer something in return to the other person or the other party, at least $1 if it pertains to money. Then the other side has to accept the offer, which Israel did, and make a promise to perform. And that's what they said. They said, we promise we're going to do it, right? A promise to perform. And then the agreement to the specific terms of the covenant, they said, whatever he says, we will do. So now the covenant was confirmed in writing on both sides, because Moses wrote the book of the covenant and Yahovah wrote the same thing on tablets of stone. He wrote the commandments and the law with his own finger. He didn't have Moses write that. Why? Because in a covenant, both parties need to sign the agreement. Moses' handwriting was the signature of Israel because he was representing Israel. Yahovah's handwriting was Yahovah's signature because he represents himself. Now, the children of Israel have the book of the covenant. That is their copy of the legal document for their records. Yahovah, the tablets of stone that he wrote, was his copy of the covenant for his records. Now, where did Yahovah keep his copy? He kept it in the ark. He told Moses, build me an ark, and that is where you can come to meet with me. The ark will be in the tabernacle. And he told Moses, put these stones in the ark. So when he built the ark, he made a specific place for these stones to be kept. As a result, the ark was now called the Ark of the Covenant. So this is how Yahovah works. He sees ahead of time what is needed, what he's going to do. He plans on how he's going to do it. This now, since Yahovah is present at the ark where they must come to meet with him, he keeps what belongs to him in the ark. That's how important this covenant was to him. He's not going to leave it to Moses to take care of it. He's not going to leave it to the people to take care of it. He is going to keep it in a safe place on him because it is very important. Now, the book of the covenant is the people's copy. So now they said they're going to obey it. Moses now has to teach it to them. If you want to see Yahovah's covenant, the full covenant that Yahovah wrote, the covenant between Israel and himself, you can read this covenant that starts from Exodus 20 and verse 1, and it goes all the way to Exodus 23 and verse 33. Now we know that the 10 Commandments starts at Exodus 20 verse 1 to verse 17. That's the end of the 10 Commandments. But now, Yahovah hadn't given them everything yet because they couldn't hear it. They couldn't stand to hear it. So when he gave the rest of it to Moses, it went all the way to Exodus 23 and verse 33. So the covenant that Yahovah made with Israel was the marriage covenant. And that covenant is 4 chapters long. So we don't just stop and says, oh, it's just the 10 Commandments. No, those 4 chapters include even the feasts of Yahovah. He requires them to keep it. It is part of the covenant. So when we come into covenant with Yahovah, all those 4 chapters are important for us to keep. Because when they said, we will keep your covenant, they say, we will obey you fully, but we will keep your covenant. That is very important to pay attention to. So the sealed book of the covenant is Israel's legal and official copy to keep for their records, and the tablets of stone with the law, the whole covenant, are Yahovah's legal copy to keep for his records. This covenant contains the words for them to obey and the covenant for them to keep. Yahovah promised to make them into a holy nation and a kingdom of priests. So if they do their part, this is what Yahovah will do for them. Now, because Yahovah went and got Israel and brought them to himself, okay, and he made this covenant with them, he said that they would be a treasured people to him, right? So now they are his possession. That means he has set them aside for himself. They are his. That means the people are sanctified as a holy nation unto Yahovah. They are sanctified. Up until that time, everything was good. They were not worshiping any idols. They were being good, and they sealed the covenant. Moses started reading it to them. They got it. Now, Yahovah told Moses, when you're done with that, come back up to me, because I have more things to give you. And when Moses went up now, remember, they're married now, okay? This is Yahovah's bride. He is their husband, okay? So, in a physical marriage, both the man and the woman have to vow to enter into this exclusive relationship with each other, meaning the husband doesn't get any other women and the wife doesn't get any other men. No relationships with each opposite sex. Each of you have only the both of you, nobody else. Okay, well, in the same way, Israel vowed to not enter into any other relationship with any other God. He was their exclusive God. He had an exclusive relationship with them. He was their husband. They were his wife. Yahovah said, I am Yahovah your God, who brought you out of Egypt. And he explained to them that the whole earth is his, but he has chosen them for his own possession. and that he is a jealous God. Now, if you do certain things, then you will see his jealousy. What were they not supposed to do? They were not supposed to worship any other god, no idolatry. That was the pet peeve that he had. I am your God. I mean, every husband has that pet peeve. If his wife should go out and cheat on him, every wife has that pet peeve if the husband should go out and cheat on her. Okay? And so he said, if you do this, you will be punished. Not just you, but your children will be punished for your sins to the third and fourth generation, because what you have done would tell me that you hate me. You do not love me. That is why you went out and had another god before me. You hate me, because if you didn't hate me, you would not have done that. But for those who love me, I will show love to them and to their children for 1,000 generations of them that love me and keep my commandments. So keeping the marriage vow, which is the covenant, shows love. It shows that you love him and not hate him. And Yahovah said unto Moses, come up to me in the mount, and be there, and I will give you tablets of stone and a law and commandments which I have written, that you may teach them. Then Moses entered the cloud, and he went up to the mountain, and he stayed on the mountain for 40 days and 40 nights. This is in Exodus 24 and verse 18. The Sabbath covenant is a sign between Yahovah and Israel forever. Yahovah emphasized that. By keeping the Sabbath covenant, Yahovah makes Israel holy. Remember, he promised to make them a holy nation. But this one commandment in all the covenant that he made, this was a very important covenant, because this was the highlight. Because he said the Sabbath covenant is a sign between himself and Israel. So by keeping it, they would be made holy. He was going to make them into a holy nation. And he told them, remember to do this. So when Yahovah finished speaking to Moses on Mount Sinai, he gave him the tablets of the covenant, the tablets of stone inscribed by his finger. And on his way down, Moses was surprised when he came down the mountain. He dropped the tablets of stone, dropped the 2 tablets of stone. Because what he saw was that the people had violated the blood covenant because they were worshiping an idol, the golden calf. And they were told that was a very important portion of the relationship. He talked about how he was jealous. He emphasized, don't do this. This is very important. We have an exclusive covenant. Don't do this. And it was afterwards that they went ahead and did this, as if they didn't know better, because Moses had read it to them, but they still did it. Well, they thought Moses wasn't coming back, even though he had returned before. But this time, because he was going a longer period, they figured, well, probably he's dead. He's not coming back. Well, in the covenant law, we find that Israel would become a holy nation, because we just read about that. And Yahovah also gave Moses the schematics, the blueprint for making the tabernacle and for the priestly garments and who should be priest and all the furnishings and the articles of the tabernacle. Because what was he doing here? He was fulfilling his promise to them to make them a kingdom of priests. And so Yahovah started his portion. He made a vow that this is what he was going to do, so he got started on it right away. The Israelites were down there goofing off. They were actually breaking the covenant while he was doing his part of the covenant. Now, remember he said he was jealous? And when Moses saw that, Yahovah told Moses that's what they're doing down there. Moses went and saw it for himself. So these holy standards that Yahovah had set up in the covenant was very important for him to do what he had promised them to do. And that is the reason why they could not be made into a holy nation. And they could not be a kingdom of priests because they deserve death. They're supposed to die now. This is what they did. As a result, that generation that came out of Egypt died off. And it was their descendants who made it into the promised land. Now, when they broke the covenant after sealing it, Moses told them what a bad thing that they had done, because now they deserved death. But he had to go and intercede for them, and then otherwise Yahovah would have destroyed them in his anger. But he interceded for them, and the nation of Israel, they didn't die. He didn't kill them, but they lost their peace with him. Their unfaithfulness and their ignorance of him. Remember, Moses said, he has come to prove you so that the fear of him will be in you. Now, if they had the guts to stand there, if they had the courage to stand there and listen to the rest of what he had, then maybe, they would have that fear of God in them and would not go and break the covenant. But now that they were too afraid, they end up being unfaithful because they were ignorant of him. In spite of the warnings in the first commandment and the second commandment, they blew it. Anyway, Moses declared that Yahovah had entered into a covenant with his people at Mount Sinai, and God announces his jealousy over his wife. So it was not a surprise to them. In Ezekiel 16, verses 15 to 19, Yahovah describes how Israel was unfaithful to him. Previously, he described his love for them. But now that they broke his covenant, he now is describing how they were unfaithful to him. Now, he had, between Exodus and Ezekiel, it had been quite a few years. And he has been telling them, encouraging them, counseling them to come back to him. Don't stay out there. Though you did this, you should still come back to me. Because while they were out there away doing what they do, they didn't have his protection. They were outside of the covenant and outside of his protection. So he says the reason why they did it, what they did, he said, but you trusted in your own beauty and played the harlot because of your renown, or that means because of your fame, because of your celebrity, being the people of Yahovah. And you poured out your fornications on everyone that passed by. So it wasn't just one God that they had gone out to worship. They were just worshiping any God and every God that they came into contact with. So they gave themselves to these gods. And of your garments that you did take. Remember in the original, when he was talking about his love for them, he was talking about how he had clothed them in silk and fine linen and jewelry and all of this, and badger's skin. And he said, and of your garments you did take and decked your high places with divers colors. So instead of wearing what he had given to them, they gave these gifts to the gods and played the harlot with them. The like things shall not come, neither shall it be so. You had also taken your fair jewels and your gold and silver, which I had given you, and made to yourself images of men, and did commit whoredom with them, and took your embroidered garments, which I gave you, and covered these idols which you made. And you set my oil and my incense before these idols, these gods, and my meat also, which I gave you, fine flour and oil and honey, wherewith I fed you, you have even set it before them for a sweet savor. And thus it was, says Yahovah Elohim. Now, talking about setting this food before these idols, I noticed that when I go to get my nails done, these Buddha in the store, they have like a bowl of fruits and food in front of the Buddha. I was wondering about that when I read this. So they're feeding they set it in front of them. Yahovah is talking about the same stuff that is going on today. The children of Israel were doing the same stuff. So it's not new. They're doing it the same way today. So Ezekiel 16:15-34 and Hosea 2 verse 2-5, these two prophets, they document Israel's guilt of harlotry. In a physical marriage, when a wife violates her marriage covenant by giving herself to another man, this is committing adultery. When the husband violates the marriage covenant by giving himself to another woman, that violates the marriage covenant, and thereby it is committing adultery. In the same way, Israel committed spiritual adultery against Yahovah by worshiping other gods. In Jeremiah 3 verses 6-10, actually Jeremiah 3 verses 6-18, Yahovah had pleaded with the house of Israel for 100 years. And after 100 years of pleading with the house of Israel to return to him, she continued to refuse to heed his counsel and warnings. Now, the house of Israel is not the house of Judah, because the nation of Israel had split into two after Solomon's death. And house of Israel went their way, but house of Judah remained. So now, because house of Israel was gone, he continued to try to bring her back, but she refused. And it had been 100 years. So Yahovah, what did he do? He issued a bill of divorce to the house of Israel. He didn't do that with the house of Judah. But the house of Israel, they are the lost 10 tribes of Israel. However, he did not divorce the house of Judah. His marriage covenant with Judah remained. Now in Jeremiah 3 and verse 14, Yahovah says, "Turn, O backsliding children, says Yahovah, for I am married unto you." So he's saying, you're not out of the covenant. You're still in the covenant, though you broke it, because I am keeping my end of this covenant. So the covenant has not been dissolved, because you're not dead, though you broke it. You're still in a covenant with me. So come back to me. But they refused. In Isaiah 54 and verse 5, the prophet Isaiah proclaimed, "For thy maker is thine husband. Yahovah of hosts is his name, and your Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel." So here, the prophets are confirming that Israel is Yahovah's wife, and he is their husband. So this is a husband and wife relationship. And you wonder, why did Yahovah go into this husband and wife relationship? I think he did it to teach us. He's the one who instituted marriage. So he did it to teach us how a marriage is supposed to work, even when one person is unfaithful. I am just amazed at his wisdom and his ability to plan and to teach. He does things when we're not even thinking about it. And then you read and you learn, oh, that's an example for us to follow. No, we're not supposed to break the covenant. But how he kept the covenant is what he's trying to teach us. When we walk into this covenant, we do not take it lightly, because it still remains a covenant. Until the other person dies, you're not out of the covenant. And remember, Israel didn't die because Moses pleaded for her, for Israel, and he didn't kill her. So you're not out of the covenant if the other person doesn't die. Okay, so he tells her, you're still in a covenant with me, come home. She didn't do that. And in Isaiah 59 and verse 2, Yahovah says to Israel, "But your iniquities have separated between you and your God, and your sins have hid his face from you." that he will not hear you. So here we see that they were not protected while they were out there. If they cried out to him, he could not hear them because the sin had separated them. No one with sin can dwell with Yahovah. They cannot dwell with Yahovah. Sin cannot dwell with Yahovah. But Yahovah described Israel as an adulterous wife in Hosea chapter 1 and 2 because she left him to serve pagan gods, other gods, despite her covenant with him. But even so, he continued to be faithful to the covenant, even though she was unfaithful. It seems like I am repeating this, and the only reason it is being repeated, it's because Yahovah was very patient with them. He kept encouraging them to come back. In Ezekiel 16, the prophets, Yahovah keeps talking to them through the prophets, and they still wouldn't listen. In Ezekiel 16, verses 8 through 29, Yahovah is talking again to Israel. But in verse 8, he says, "Your time was the time of love." So he's reflecting on what it used to be, how it used to be. And he said, "And I swore an oath to you and enter into covenant with you, and you were mine. You became mine. You became mine." But now he says, "I have been a loving husband to you. I cared for you and I provided for you." This is what a husband is supposed to do for his wife, even till today. "But you became unfaithful by giving yourself to spiritual harlotry through pagan worship." That's what they did. She resorted to burning even her children alive as sacrifice to false gods. She had high places to worship false gods. Not just one god, but gods. She committed spiritual adultery by entering into forbidden alliances with foreign idolatrous nations. And Yahovah, speaking of the Jews and their political actions in Jerusalem, he said that they were a brazen harlot, meaning in your face kind of harlot, not even hiding it. Knowing that they're doing wrong, they were brazen about it. And he described them as having degenerate hearts. He said, "How degenerate is your heart, seeing you do all these things." Degenerate is a word that you don't want to be described by. The deeds of a brazen harlot. So when we hear him say that, now we know that when he offered the new covenant, that's why he said, "I'm going to give you a new heart. I'm going to take out your stony heart." Because as long as they're doing this, it means they have a stony heart. They do not have a heart of flesh. And his laws are not written on their heart. But he said, "I'm going to take out your stony heart. I'm going to give you a new heart, a heart of flesh, and I will write my law on it." So this way, they will have a heart to serve him. But that's not all that he promised in the new covenant. But when we get to it, we will list those things. But still, they refused to submit to him. They didn't want him to be their God or their king. They preferred to use foreign countries and make alliance with them for those countries to rule over them. But Yahovah says, "Because of your filthiness was poured out, and your nakedness uncovered in your harlotry with your lovers, and with all your abominable idols, and because of the blood of your children, which you gave to them." I can hardly believe, given your children, burning your children as a sacrifice. Every time I read that, I'm like, how could you do that to a child? How could you do that to a baby? But they love their idol gods enough to do that. And he said, "You know what? I will judge you as women who break wedlock or shed blood are judged. And I will bring blood upon you in fury and jealousy." He would also bring the same thing upon the nations that committed harlotry with them. It's not just Israel that was going to be punished. Those countries and those nations that committed harlotry with Israel, they were going to be punished too. because he wasn't going to let them get away with it. He said, all the earth is mine. So he can punish them. And the covenant was for Israel to be a light to the world. So those people were supposed to coming in. They were supposed to bring them in to learn about the salvation of Yahovah. Instead, they were out there committing harlotry with them. In Judges chapter 2, verses 10 through 13, we read that after Israel took possession of the promised land under Joshua, the people were faithful to Yahovah's covenant while Joshua and the elders lived. But once the elders and Joshua died off, they violated the covenant. And these descendants did exactly what their parents did. Worshipping idols, pagan gods, forsaking the covenant that they had with Yahovah. And you know, the next generation who lived through the wilderness and entered into Canaan, they had come to have a relationship with God through the wilderness. They were now ready. They were holy and ready to get into the promised land, because now if you're unholy, he can't bring you in. So they had met the criteria to come in. So it's not like they didn't know him. They had the fear of God in them. But once Joshua and the elders died off, nobody to watch over us, so we can do it. Now, did they believe that Yahovah could not see them? Obviously. Or they were just, what we call in the workplace, they were just eye pleasers. They were just pleasing the authority over them because they could see them. But the minute their back was turned, they could do whatever they wanted to do. Yahovah was not pleased with that. So now he wants to reconcile with them. He was asking them to come, but they're not coming. He was counseling them to come, but they're not coming. Now he wants to reconcile the marriage. So in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 10 to 11, Paul is speaking about this. He is not speaking about Yahovah and Israel, but he is speaking about how the wife, natural wife and husband, us today, are supposed to live with each other. He said, to the married, I give this command, not I, but Yahovah. He says, a wife must not separate from her husband. That's exactly what the children of Israel did. They separated from father. But if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband. So Yahovah kept calling her back because she wasn't married to anybody out there, but she had left. And a husband must not divorce his wife. Not he said it. He said, not I, but Yahovah says this. Okay? Then in verses 12 to 14, he said, but to the rest of you, I say, not the Lord says. Right? So he gives his opinion on non-married people, how life should work for them. But that's not our focus today. We are focusing on the marriage. So Yahovah now wants to reconcile his marriage with Israel. And so in Isaiah 54 verses 5 to 8, he says, for thy maker is thine husband. So there's no doubt of the relationship between them. Yahovah of hosts is his name, and your Redeemer, the Holy One of Israel. Who is the Holy One of Israel? Who is the Holy One of Israel? It's their maker, their husband, their God, the God of the whole earth. For Yahovah has called thee as a woman forsaken and grieved in spirit, and a wife of youth when you were refused, says Yahovah. For a small moment have I forsaken you, but with great mercies I will gather you. So he had to divorce them because after 100 years and you're not coming, I've got to put separation between me and you. He had to do that because they refused. But with great mercies will I gather thee. In a little wrath I hid my face from you for a moment, but with everlasting kindness will I have mercy on you, says Yahovah, your Redeemer. So Yahovah has pled with them. Now it's not just the house of Israel, it's now also the house of Judah, because Judah has turned away from him now. They have gone to do the same thing. When Ezekiel 20, verses 33 to 37, Yahovah says, as I live, says Yahovah Elohim, Surely with a mighty hand, with an outstretched arm, and with fury poured out, I will rule over you. I will bring you out of the countries where you are scattered, right? Because he had to scatter them. He sent them into exile. And with a mighty hand, with an outstretched arm, and with fury poured out, I will bring you into the wilderness of the peoples, and there I will plead my case with you face to face. So he's determined to reconcile this marriage. Just as I pleaded my case with your fathers in the wilderness of the land of Egypt, so I will plead my case with you, says Yahovah Elohim. I will make you pass under the rod, and I will bring you into the bond of the covenant. But by making them pass under the rod, it means they will be punished. They're not going to get away with this. And then he will bring you into the bond of the covenant, which means he's going to draw them in like on a rope, where they're coming in, maybe kicking and screaming, but he's going to bring them back into the covenant. So the Apostle Paul tells us that under the old covenant between Yahovah and Israel, their relationship was based on holiness. So as long as we remain unholy, his face will be turned from us. But thank God for Yeshua. Today, we can ask forgiveness and return to him. But remember, when we return to him, it must be with a whole heart, not with the intention that we're going to do it again and ask forgiveness again and do it again and ask forgiveness again. Because Paul says, should we continue in sin that grace may abound? God forbid. However, Yahovah was aware of their weaknesses, of being ignorant about who he is and not having the fear of God. And so he knew why they were doing that. So in his mercy, he overlooked their ignorance and did not punish them. As a matter of fact, his forbearance of their sins that they had committed beforehand, he left them unpunished. He didn't punish them for their sins. Because if he had punished them for their sins, they would have been dead. But in Acts 14 and verse 16, we see that he allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways without destroying them in his wrath. They were ignorant of him, of who he was. They were worshiping him, but they didn't know who he was. But in his mercy, he overlooked their ignorance. And that's under the old covenant. In his forbearance, he left their sins that they had committed beforehand unpunished. The disobedient conformed to their evil desires that they had while living in ignorance of Yahovah, who they worshipped. So they were doing it, but they didn't understand what they were doing when they came back to him. I'm talking about the house of Judah now. They came back to him. They were in Babylon, and they came back to him. But they still didn't understand what they were doing because they were ignorant of him. So it is Yahovah's covenant with Israel that teaches us about him. If we read his law, we will see that he reveals himself. He reveals his disposition. He reveals his thoughts, his desires. He reveals how he interacts. He reveals his likes and dislikes. So we can't say we don't have the opportunity to know him, because all of this is revealed in the covenant. Read Exodus 20, starting at verse 1, all the way down to Exodus 23 and verse 23. If we just read it, we will see what the covenant was all about, what he expected. But because they didn't know the covenant, or they didn't understand the covenant, then they didn't get to know him. All right, so this covenant with the children of Israel is not the same covenant that he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Right? We had said that already, that the covenant he made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were unilateral. They were unconditional. It was him making a covenant, and they had nothing to do. They had nothing to give. So there was nothing exchanged. It was just him giving, making promises. So now Yahovah has two covenants that he has to fulfill. He has that covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, And now he has the covenant with Israel, and he cannot fulfill one without the other. The covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was to give them possession of the land, that they would be living in the land. But he can't bring them into the land as long as they're unholy. And they cannot be holy if they don't agree to the covenant to do what they vowed to do. So his hands are kind of tied here because he wants to make them a holy nation, but they're doing the direct opposite of what they said they would do, that he commanded them to do. He wants to make them a kingdom of priests, but he can't do it because they are so unholy and they're doing their own thing. So his hands are tied because until they do their part, he cannot do his part. So that is the reason why Yahovah said, okay, I can fix this. I'm going to make a new covenant with you. Before they broke the covenant, Moses said to them, you're a holy people to Yahovah your God. Yahovah your God has chosen you to be a people for himself, a special treasure above all the peoples on the face of the earth. Now, if that is not motivation to stay, then you got to have a stony heart to walk away from this. And obviously, they did. They had a stony heart. That's why they walked away. So Yahovah says to them, I have called you in righteousness. I have taken you by the hand and kept you. I have given you as a covenant to the people, a light to the nations, to open the eyes that are blind. Okay, that was their purpose. And Yahovah is reminding them of why he called them, why he chose them. And it was important because instead of going to the other nations to learn what they do with their gods and accepting their gods, they were supposed to turn them away. They were supposed to turn the nations away from their gods. Instead, they went and included themselves in the worship of those pagan gods. In Isaiah 61 and verse 2, when Yeshua was here, while in the synagogue, he read from Isaiah 61 verse 1 to 2. And since Israel, now why is he doing this? Because Israel was charged to do this. They were commanded to. This was the purpose for why Yahovah chose Israel in the first place. But they didn't do this. So now the Israel, the true Israel, Yahovah's Israel, he sent Yeshua so that Yeshua could fulfill what the physical Israel didn't do. He, the spiritual Israel, had to do it. So Yeshua read from Isaiah 61 and verse 1 and 2. And he said, the Spirit of Yahovah Elohim is upon me, because Yahovah has anointed me to preach good tidings unto the meek. He has sent me to bind up the brokenhearted, to proclaim liberty to the captives, and the opening of the prison to them that are bound, to proclaim the acceptable year of Yahovah. Now, he didn't finish verse 2, because the rest of what in verse 2 is not what he came to do. This is where he stopped, because that was what he was sent to do at the time that he came. When he returns, he will finish up verse 2 and continue on of what he came to do, of what he will come to do rather. So now, Yahovah made the promise of the new covenant in Jeremiah 31, verses 31 to 33. And he says, behold, the days come, says Yahovah, that I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not according to the covenant that I made with their fathers, which my covenant they broke, although I was a husband to them, says Yahovah. But this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, talking about in the future, says Yahovah. I will put my law in their inward parts and write it in their hearts, and will be their God, and they shall be my people. Now, this was to both house of Israel and house of Judah in the future, about the distant future. When he gave them this new covenant, or the promise of this new covenant, they were down in Babylon in exile. But when he said this, you see, when Yahovah speaks, we think that is a one-time deal. He speaks now and he does it and it's off the table. No. when he speaks, that same thing that he speaks will be for time and time and time again. Because if we notice when he talks about the Antichrist, that throughout the ages, there has been many Antichrists, many of them. So should we have stopped at the first Antichrist and said, oh, all the other Antichrists are Christ, not Antichrist? No, because many Antichrists have come since then. And still, we're waiting for more Antichrists to show up. It's not done yet. So whatever he says continues throughout the ages. And so when he said this, he did fulfill it. He didn't bring the house of Israel and Judah together, because it was the house of Judah that was down in Babylon, not the house of Israel, because house of Israel was already divorced and out there, not anywhere to be found. So he said, not according to the covenant that I made with your fathers, which my covenant they broke, although I was a husband unto them, says Yahovah, but this shall be the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel. After those days, as Yahovah, says Yahovah, I will put my law in their inward parts and write it in their hearts, and will be their God, and they shall be my people. So in order to bring them together, he has to focus on the house of Israel. He has to make a special covenant with the house of Israel. Remember, the nation of Israel is made up of two houses, the house of Israel and the house of Judah. So he's going to bring them together. This hasn't happened yet. They haven't come together yet. He's promised that he's going to do it, and is faithful to his word. He's going to do it. Time will tell when he does it. It will happen, though. He gives the same covenant in Ezekiel 36. And in 37, he said, well, let's start at 34, but the covenant actually starts at 37. But just for a little bit of background, he said, for I will take you from among the heathen and gather you out of all countries and bring you to your land. Currently, both the house of Judah and the house of Israel are both in exile. They are scattered throughout the nations right now. So they are not in their land. So this one in Ezekiel 36 is talking about today, this age, when he brings them back together. And he said, in 25, then will I sprinkle clean water upon you, and you shall be clean. From all your filthiness and from all your idols will I cleanse you. A new heart also will I give you, and a new spirit. So he told them previously that because of their idols and stuff that they're out there doing right now, he's going to have to cleanse them first before he can bring them in and give them the new heart, etc. When he said, I will sprinkle clean water upon you, what is he talking about? We will get to that later on in this same lesson. But he said, a new heart also will I give you, and a new spirit will I put within you, and I will take away the stony heart out of your flesh. Remember when he was describing them before, he said you were degenerate. But he said, I will take your stony heart out, and I will give you a heart of flesh. Now here in Ezekiel 36, he's saying the same thing. I will take away the stony heart out of your flesh, and I will give you a heart of flesh. And I will put my spirit within you and cause you to walk in my statutes. And you shall keep my judgments and do them. And you shall dwell in the land that I gave to your fathers, and you shall be my people, and I will be your God. I will also save you from your uncleanness, and I will call for the corn and will increase it and lay no famine upon you. So here he's talking about the future when he brings them in. And I will multiply the fruit of the tree and the increase of the field, and that ye shall receive no more reproach of famine upon the heathen, among the heathen. Now, this is what he's promising them. However, Yeshua came with the new covenant, and they refused it. But Yahovah still hasn't given up on them, because they still have a covenant. None of them are dead. Yahovah cannot die, and they're not dead. So the covenant remains. Okay. Later on, Yeshua comes. And we know that he came to the Jews and he gave them the message. He said, the kingdom of God is near. Repent and believe the gospel. But they didn't want him. They rejected him. So they also rejected his message. Now, Yeshua, when he was preaching, he was actually preaching a reconciliation message, a message of reconciliation. He said, I came to my own, and my own did not receive me. So when he gave his command to the disciples, he said to them that they must preach the gospel of the kingdom only to Israel. That means house of Judah and house of Israel. He said, do not preach to the Gentiles. Do not even go in the way of the Gentiles. Why? Because this new covenant was for Israel, not for the Gentiles. And he stressed this point that they must not go in the way of the Gentiles. But later, because Yahovah had made a covenant with Abraham that through his seed all the nations of the earth will be blessed, then Yahovah turned and called the Gentiles. Yeshua told Cornelius to send to Joppa and call Peter, because now he had started pouring out his spirit on the Gentiles. Why? Because after a certain time, the Israelites weren't interested anymore. Now, some of the Jews did accept Yeshua because his disciples were Jews. And on the day of Pentecost, 3,000 were saved. And the Kahila continued to grow. The assembly continued to grow. The body of Messiah continued to grow. So there were many Jews who accepted, but the rest of them didn't want any more to do with it. So Yahovah turned to the Gentiles, and Cornelius was one of the first ones that we read about in the Bible. And now he's starting to reconcile the world to himself. So he couldn't reconcile his wife, not that he won't, but at this time they are still stubborn. But now he's starting to reconcile the world to himself, the nations of the world. Now, the Israelites were supposed to be the light to the world, to the nations of the world. But Yeshua came, the spiritual Israel came and did what the natural Israel did not do. And all those who followed him, all his disciples, were given the mandate to go and continue to do what he did, because everybody who comes in under Yeshua is now spiritual Israel. That's a wonderful thing, because we cannot be born of Abraham if we were never part of the descendants of Abraham. But we can still be Israel because Yeshua is spiritual Israel. And so now when we come into Yeshua, we become part of spiritual Israel, because we receive the spirit of Yeshua, the spirit of adoption. And this, the spirit of adoption, is what brings us into the family of Yahovah, and we become spiritual Israel. So now Yahovah is starting to reconcile the world to himself. He fulfilled the first portion. Yeshua actually fulfilled the first portion of the covenant through his blood. And many from the house of Judah partook in this covenant. So now, even though they were natural Israel, because they were born as descendants of Abraham, now they were spiritual Israel. Even though they were natural Israel, now they were spiritual Israel, because they came into the covenant through Yeshua. So if Yahovah did not complete the first part of this covenant, which is the blood of Yeshua, and Yeshua said to his disciples, drink, because this is the new covenant in my blood. So Yeshua actually came to do the new covenant, to fulfill the new covenant that Yahovah made with Israel, but now it's turned to the nations of the world, the Gentiles. Nonetheless, Yahovah prophesied that only a remnant of Israel will accept the offer of reconciliation to become his bride again. Not all of them. It is true that Yahovah did divorce the house of Israel, but not the house of Judah. Because of that, the Gentiles believe that they are the new bride that took Israel's place. But Paul said that Yahovah broke off the natural branches, meaning the natural children of Israel, because of their disobedience. So because he broke off those natural branches and engrafted the Gentiles, who are the wild branch, into the vine, the true vine, which is Yeshua, Paul said, if he could engraft wild olive branches, how much more can he engraft the natural, the cultured branches into the vine? So don't be conceited because you are now part of the natural vine. Because if God could have cut off the natural branches because of their disobedience, then he will also cut you off the wild branch if you disobey. So Yeshua said, I am the true vine. You are the branches, talking to his disciples and all disciples throughout the ages, even till today and the future. He says, I am the true vine. You are the branches, and my Father is the gardener. Okay, so I don't cut off branches and I don't engraft branches. That's what Yeshua is saying. My Father is the one who gives you to me. And when he does, he will engraft you into the true vine. He decides who will come in and who will not. Yeshua said, I don't have that choice. He didn't give me that authority. He does that. And we talked about it in our last lesson, how Yahovah chooses who he adopts into his family. So in order to reconcile his marriage to Israel, Yahovah says, on the day that I cleanse you from all your iniquities, I will also enable you to dwell in the cities, and the ruins shall be rebuilt. The desolate land shall be tilled instead of lying desolate in the sight of all who pass by. So they will say, the land that was desolate has become like the Garden of Eden, and the wasted, desolate, and ruined cities are now fortified and inhabited. Then the nations which are left all around you shall know that I, Yahovah, have rebuilt the ruined places and planted what was desolate. I, Yahovah, have spoken it, and I will do it. Thus says Yahovah Elohim, I will also let the house of Israel inquire of me to do this for them. I will increase their men like a flock offered as holy sacrifices, like the flock at Jerusalem on its feast days. So shall the ruined cities be filled with flocks of men. Then they will know that I am Yahovah. So in this, we see that it's the house of Judah that's going to be in the land before the house of Israel, because he will bring Judah to the land, he will build it up, and then he said, and the house of Israel will inquire after me. So once they start inquiring, then he will start drawing them in. And he says, it doesn't matter. I will do it. I have spoken it, and I will do it. Before the prophecy of restoration can be fulfilled, the divorce that Yahovah gave to the house of Israel, it has to be annulled. He has to get rid of that divorce. He has to give her new papers. He has to get rid of the separation divorce papers and reinstate her with new papers. So to reverse this divorce and to give her new papers, he has to first cleanse her. And so he says, I will cleanse you from all your iniquities. He has to first cleanse her before he can get started. And that's what the blood of Yeshua is all about. First, he spoke the word. He preached the gospel. He said, repent and believe the gospel. He said the word, his word is the water. The water of his word would cleanse them, would cleanse us. He cleanses us with the water of his word. So we know when we're talking about water here, we're talking about the word that Yeshua preached. He came to fulfill the new covenant. And so the word that he preached, that's why he said, believe the words that I preach. What are the words he preached? He preached them in the gospel of the kingdom of God. So they have to first repent, believe, so that they can be cleansed, and then they will be enabled to come in. Yahovah says they will start to inquire. It's just like the nations of the world. When Israel was in good standing with Yahovah and they were booming, the nations of the world were jealous. They wanted to be part of that. So they would inquire. And some of them became proselytes. They entered in. In the same way, Yahovah went out, got the Gentiles, and then Israel is currently jealous. But when the day that he brings them into the land, he's bringing in Judah, and then the house of Israel will wonder about this, and they would start inquiring, and then they will finally, he would be able to work with them to bring them. And he says, I will also let the house of Israel inquire of me. It's not that they're going to just jump up on their own and inquire. He is going to motivate them to inquire. So once they both come in, then once he cleanses them, he will put the new heart in them. He will put the new mind in them. He will give them his spirit. He will write his law on their hearts and on their mind. And then the marriage is reconciled. So the marriage reconciliation was originally intended for Israel, but because they refused, he turned to the Gentiles and allowed them to enter into the door through Yeshua so they could be part of the new covenant. However, that's not the end of the story. He will return to Israel and motivate them to come back to him so he can complete that marriage covenant. Later on in Yeshua's teachings, he said, in that day, talking about the day of the judgment, he said, many will come to me and they will say, Lord, Lord, didn't I preach in your name, heal the sick in your name, did many miracles in your name? And he will still say to them, I do not know you, you workers of iniquity. So when he says that, when we know that iniquity is lawlessness, why does he say that? He's saying this to people who are not in covenant with him. And if they don't know what the covenant is, then they cannot go into covenant with him. And many of them have been told what the covenant is, but they say, no, that is for the Jews only. That's for Israel only. That's not for us. Well, Father never did change his laws in the covenant. If he did, then idolatry would be legal. It wouldn't be a sin. Fornication wouldn't be a sin. Covetousness and honoring your father and mother or dishonoring your father and mother would not be a sin. Adultery would not be a sin. Stealing and murder and lying would not be a sin if he had done away with the law, if he had done away with the covenant. So it is ridiculous when people say, Jesus kept the law, so we don't have to keep it. Well, that's wrong. Under the new covenant, Yahovah says, and he's the one who making the new covenant. He says, everyone that sins, and what does that mean? Everyone that transgressed the law will die for his own sins. So saying that Yeshua kept the law so we don't have to keep it is ridiculous. Everyone will have to die for his own sins. This is coming out of Yahovah's mouth. And we can read that in Jeremiah 31 and verse 30. It's also in Ezekiel 18 and verse 18 and 20 and Deuteronomy 24 and verse 6. He offered the new covenant back then, and he hasn't changed. He brought Yeshua to fulfill it. And today we are entering into his family through the new covenant. We are becoming part of the bride through the new covenant. So when we say, no, the law has been done away with, then we don't even know what the new covenant is. We cannot enter into the new covenant. So say and sing and pray and testify to be the bride of Christ as much as you want. You're not even in the running. So I encourage everyone who doesn't understand the new covenant to read the 4 chapters where the covenant is and why the new covenant was offered, and understand that we enter into the bride of Christ, of Messiah. We enter into the bride of Messiah in through the door that Yahovah has provided for us, which is Yeshua, and we enter in through his blood so that we can be part of the covenant. This covenant, Yahovah has kept safe, his copy. He has kept it safe in the ark. That's why today we have the Ark of the Covenant. And people say the ark is lost. It's lost to us because we don't know where it is. But it's not lost to him because he knows exactly where it is. Men can search as long as they want and as far as they want, but it's lost to us because we don't know where it is. It's not lost to Yahovah because he knows exactly where it is. Well, thank you for being here today. That was what I had to share today, and I hope you enjoyed it because I sure did. I hope you got something out of it and that it is enough to stimulate your mind, your thoughts, and your motivation to read and ask questions and seek to understand. Now, this blog has a place where you can type a message, even has SpeakPipe where you don't have to type. You can just speak what your questions are, and I will definitely get back to you. But please feel free to share this with someone and to become involved in learning and understanding. I hope you have a great week, and I hope this was beneficial to you, and I hope to see you again in Lesson 14. May Yahovah bless you and keep you. And this is Hillary saying bye for now.